Hello, I'm Beko Pin. It is past 11 p.m. in New York and past 11 a.m. in Manila. I'm joined by my colleague Sofia Toma Cruz because earlier today, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. addressed for the first time the United Nations during the high-level general debates at the UN General Assembly. We'll be giving you a quick recap of what happened. Hopefully, we'll try to help you make sense of what the president said and what he didn't say. During his speech and his address earlier. Pero before we jump into the mismong address, no, like I said, I'm here in New York. We're covering both not just the UNGA participation, but also this is a 6-day working visit for the president. In connection to that, may mga side meetings, the details of which we will be announcing or the palace will be announcing in the coming days kasi may mga things na fluid pa. Pero just for context, no, so kanina, yun nga, nagsimula yung general debates ng UNGA. So medyo intense yung security all over, not all over New York City rather, but in the immediate vicinity of the UN headquarters. So parang bawat block makikita mo may NYPD na nakastasyon, kotse, tsaka mga police officers na nakabantay. Tapos kanina din, kung naglalakad ka sa New York, makikita mo mga convoy ng kung sino-sino na mga top government officials, heads of state even, making their way through the city. And in fact, kanina din, dumaan tayo sa Philippine Consulate ng Permanent Mission to the UN. May maliit na protest doon. May protest doon ng mga hindi lang Filipino at PhilAm, kundi pati na rin mga allies nila, not necessarily Filipinos, not necessarily PhilAms, protesting not just President Marcos's appearance before the UNGA, but also commemorating the declaration of martial law on the 20th in the US, 21st na sa Philippines. Paglilinaw lang na 21 yung pag-antedate ni Ferdinand Marcos Sr., yung tatay ng current president. In-antedate niya yung document. The actual announcement was made on the 23rd, although arrests started happening on the 22nd pa lang. So yun yung context of not just what's immediately happening during the UNGA, no, pero yung context of Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s visit to New York and the UNGA. So Sophia, kanina sa speech ni President Marcos Jr., it was a little over 20 minutes if I'm not mistaken. He opened with the UNCLOS. Ano ang UNCLOS, Sophia? And okay, so and what did he not say in that opening statement as well?
Yeah. So overall, it's quite an interesting speech. Tama na, Bea, he did open with reference to UNCLOS, in the context of talking about how the Philippines has had a strong legacy in terms of upholding international law. So unang-una na mention niya yung 1982 Manila Declaration on the Peaceful Settlement of International Disputes. That was something that was passed, yeah, that Manila helped shepherd. And what it really is about is that countries should dialogue and seek to resolve their disputes through peaceful means. And in that context, I mentioned niya rin na aside from the Manila Declaration, the Philippines has also his words were his specific words were reinvigorated the reliability and stability of international law, particularly sa UNCLOS. So ano ba yung UNCLOS, diba? It's something we always mention. It's also something we always hear time and time again. But the UNCLOS stands for the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. It was a passing reference to the 2016 Hague ruling, which the president did not explicitly mention. But the way that he brought up the West Philippine Sea and the South China Sea in his UN speeches by referencing UNCLOS and saying that the Philippines has contributed to its stability and reliability because the Hague ruling, which the Philippines won against China in 2016, clarified several provisions of UNCLOS, which is basically parang siya yung constitution ng oceans, the rules of the road that govern how ships and people should behave while they're out at sea. Also what's allowed and what's not. So significant din yun because in context of the West Philippine Sea, it's what invalidated China's historical claims to Philippine waters, precisely by using the rule of law. So it was if you compare it to when we talk about the Hague ruling in the West Philippine Sea in UNCLOS, the reference or the point of comparison will always be currently is President Duterte's 2020
Mm.
speech at the UNGA itself. Um,
Mm-mm.
if you compare the two, mas forceful yung
Yeah.
statement ni Duterte kasi explicit talaga yung mention niya sa Hague ruling. And I just wanna I'll quote directly what former President Duterte said at the time. He said, "The ward is now part of international law, beyond compromise and beyond the reach of passing governments to dilute, diminish, or abandon." And he also mentioned that the Philippines would firmly reject attempts to undermine it. So, parang bombshell statement siya.
Yeah.
Yung time na yun. Um, because it was so forceful and because it was the Duterte's first time appearing at the
Yes.
UN,
Yeah.
which he
And that,
yeah,
to add to that, Sophia, di ba? First time in the UN after years of skipping an actual address, parating DFA secretary yung pinapadala ng Pilipinas sa first
yeah.
few years of the Duterte administration. Anyway, continue, we're saying.
So, in the context of Marcos, parang may certain expectation na kailangan niya erase yun. Kasi aside from it being a core
Mm-mm.
issue for the Philippines,
Mm.
it was also in the context of that, it's the first time that a Philippine president was physically present to
Mm.
deliver an address at the high-level debates in nearly a decade.
Yeah.
So, some people may have been disappointed na walang explicit mention ng Hague ruling, but there was that championing of the UNCLOS. Actually, interesting din kasi yung, parang yung mas forceful na statement
Yeah.
the stronger statement was on climate change, which, uh, Bea, you were there, so perhaps you can tell us more about that in detail.
Yeah, parang kumbaga nga sa speech niya, parang a huge portion was devoted to talking about climate change. And I think this also ties to his hindi naman personal project, pero as we all know, 'di ba, the president himself has chosen to be the
Yeah.
agriculture secretary of the Philippines, right? So obviously food security is a big concern. Actually, explicit na sinabi niya, 'di ba, na food security heading into the US. I mean, upon his departure from Manila, parang na-emphasize din niya na that's something that he wants to bring up. And I think in the coming days, we'll see sa mga side meetings niya dito sa, while during his working visit to New York, we'll see the manifestation of that, na yung thrust nga towards food security. Frankly, it's nothing, kumbaga, forceful siya, but it's nothing new. Maybe that also quite dilutes yung
Mhm.
impact sana ng statements of President Marcos on climate change. But again, like you said, such a parang like the Hague ruling, diba? This is a core issue for us because although we aren't the worst polluter in the world, we're among those who suffer the most because of climate change. So yung gist niya is to say na the countries who pollute the most or contribute the most to the climate change crisis should be the ones who pick up the slack and kumbaga compensate for what it's doing to poorer nations, the most vulnerable nations, including the
Yeah.
Philippines.
Mhm. Yung isa pang interesting na topic sa UN speech ni President Marcos was what he said about the UN Security Council.
Mm,
So, specifically, he mentioned that we'll mention the specific quote as well. Yes. So,
mm-mm.
specifically, he called for a reformed and more
Yeah,
inclusive Security Council,
yeah,
and a General Assembly that can hold the council to account. And what was kind of a surprise statement, or what
yeah,
we didn't expect, was that President
yeah,
Marcos called for countries to support the Philippines
yeah.
uh, candidature to the UN body for the 2027 to 2028 term.
Mm-mm.
So yun yung parang bago diba sa
Yeah,
lahat.
yeah,
And I think it's I mean, you probably spoke to experts as well, but before you give us their take, no, I think it's worth pointing out that it's interesting that he mentioned that it's not surprising because of course this specific UN General Assembly is happening against the backdrop of the ongoing war in Ukraine.
mm,
So there have been mounting calls for reform
yeah,
of the Security Council, especially because the permanent five members, among one of them being Russia,
Yeah.
has veto power, and
Yeah.
so any resolution that would be passed that would be against the interests of any of those members, you can expect them to veto, right? Which,
Yeah.
for anybody, for any observer, doesn't what kind of defies logic,
Yeah.
which I think, I mean, has always been an issue that has been raised in the past, but has gained a renewed push,
Yeah.
especially in the context of what's happening in Ukraine. No,
Hmm.
um, I maybe some people will be asking as well, like, why would a country like the Philippines even vie for a seat at the UN Security Council? Well, first of all, no, there is history, there is precedent for the Philippines to have a seat there. We have had a couple of um, stints at the UN Security Council.
Yeah.
And if we're going to look at history, um, the Philippines has always been a country that's, well, the term that that observers and experts like use is, we're a country that's always kind of punched above its weight,
Hmm.
um, in our contribution to strengthening the UN system and improving it. Um, we can look back as far as the time when uh, the UN Charter was being formed, no, and it's
Yeah.
actually the Philippines was among countries that was opposed to the veto power that was being given to the five permanent members of the UN Security
Hmm.
Council,
Hmm.
and have very the Philippines has always actively pushed for the right to independence of all countries, especially countries that were still colonies at the time.
Yeah.
So in terms of why the Philippines would even have a seat, there has been that historical precedent, and that's kind of the spirit that the Philippines has always brought to the UN, which is considered the most important international body. Pero
Yeah.
ano yung mga sabi ng mga experts?
Yeah. Hindi, dagdag ko lang kasi parang siguro kahit ako naman bago ako naging reporter, wala akong kaalam-alam ano ba yung Security Council na yan. Baka nagtataka yung mga like people watching or wondering ano ba yung Security Council. So parang a lot of experts see it as kumbaga the teeth of the UN. Ito yung enforcing arm niya kumbaga kasi 'di ba sa UN itself, exchange of ideas, batuhan ng suggestions at proposed policies, pero it's in the Security Council na talagang nagbobotohan, enforceable siya, dapat asterisk din yan kasi but in an ideal world all of the nations agree to whatever the Security Council decides on. And yung peculiarity that Sophia mentioned, na yung 5 miyembro na yon, yung permanent members, kailangan sang-ayon sila 5, as in all 5 of them, for anything to be passed in the Security Council. So, isang bansa lang dyan mag-reject, let's say China or even the US, wala na. Hindi na siya mapapasa na resolution, 'di ba? So, yung mga moves ngayon ng mga tao kasi nga what people are experts are saying that the way the membership works now in Security Council is a snapshot of the post World War II parang world order. So literally yung Second World War pa to, 'di ba? So the 5 countries were determined, quote, based on their importance in the aftermath of World War II. Clearly, we live in a very different world now. So parang people are questioning, parang tama pa ba that the Security Council, the most powerful body in the UN, is designed based on that paradigm. Yung mga moves ngayon, people questioning na parang maybe it's time to rethink yung types of membership, even the idea of having a permanent member and a non-permanent member. Yung non-permanent members pala, 10 sila. They're elected to 2-year terms, kaya ang nabanggit ni President Marcos 2027 to 2028, coincidentally the last year of his term as president. Tas umiikot yung membership ng seats sa non-permanent members, 5 for Asia and Africa, isa for Eastern European states, 2 for Latin America and the Caribbean states, and 2 for Western Europe and other states. So there are also calls to expand membership. Bakit 10 lang yung non-permanent members? Tapos yun din, tapos meron din suggestions, I think, I don't know where this is, I forget where this is coming from exactly, no, na parang for the permanent members imbes na veto power daw in issues that involve parang the security of the entire world, although arguably anything that the Security Council discusses by
Yeah.
default would involve the security of the entire world, for them to voluntarily let go of that veto power, which is kind of weird kasi voluntary pa rin. Hindi pa rin sila compelled to let go of their veto power. So when we say veto power, basically if they vote no, wala na. Hindi na talaga siya mapapasa. So yun, interesting din yun na yung call for President Marcos's call to do that. And a refresher for everyone, no? Former President Duterte, when he spoke before the UNGA naman virtually then in 2021, his last address before the general debates, he also chastised the Security Council kasi sabi niya, quote, "It's neither democratic nor transparent in its representation and processes." So hindi rin bago for a Philippine president to criticize. I mean, in very, very recent history, we're talking about last year, hindi bago for a Philippine president to criticize how the Security Council, the most important, arguably, and most powerful body in the UN is working. Dagdag din na context sa pitch ni President Marcos. He cited the creation of the Bangsamoro Administrative Region of
Yeah.
Muslim Mindanao, the successes in that, as proof or kumbaga as reason to admit the Philippines, to vote for the Philippines as a non-permanent member for 2027 and 2028. And that's interesting because if you trace the roots of the Moro struggle, of the Bangsamoro struggle, yung turning point niya was during the martial law years, specifically the Jabida massacre, nung may mga batang Muslim na ni-recruit at train sa Corregidor. Nung parang nagkagulo yung mga plano, minasacre sila. May isang survivor, siya ang nagkwento nung nangyari sa Corregidor. And that triggered the movement for self-rule sa among our Bangsamoro, our brothers and sisters in the Bangsamoro. So it's interesting, the dynamics of again, ito nga parang everywhere President Marcos goes, whether he wants to or not, bit-bit niya talaga yung legacy ng naunang President Marcos sa kanya. Yun lang parang yung context. Siyempre, ibang-iba na yung mundo ngayon sa Bangsamoro. As you know, naging arm siya, tapos naging BARM siya. Yung BARM was a result of the negotiations of various groups but led by the MILF, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, also an offshoot of that struggle for self-determination ng ating brothers and sisters in the Bangsamoro region. Actually recently lang din, a few weeks ago, President Marcos already appointed new members of the interim government because the Bangsamoro is still in transition until 2025. So yun lang, context lang doon kasi yun yung main pitch kumbaga ni President Marcos in asserting na the Philippines deserves to hold a non-permanent seat as a member of the Security Council. For context, let me double check. The last time we were a member was from 2004 to 2005. It's been so by the time if we get that membership in 2027, it'll be over 2 decades na since the Philippines was a member of the Security Council. So yun, para lang maintindihan nyo bakit big deal or saan nakakuha ng audacity ang Pilipinas kumbaga to say that we want to be a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council come 2027. Sophie, ito iba. Sige, go ahead.
Just a quick point, no. Because you're talking about the UN Security Council, I think it might be relevant as well to maybe it could be one of the reasons why one way of looking at going back to the Hague, the statement on UNCLOS, and not an explicit mention of the Hague ruling, it could be one way of looking at why it was phrased the way it was, in the context of the Philippines is trying to vie for a seat at the UN Security Council, so it's trying to put forth a more productive position, I suppose, because for some people, notably China, for some countries, notably China na isang permanent member sa UN Security Council, non-starter na yung if you mention the Hague ruling, they have a automatic response that they don't recognize it. So could be viewed that's one way of looking at why the statement was phrased the way it was. Also considering that both the statement on the UN Security Council and rule of law or holding international law, it's also done in the context of the theme of this UN General Assembly
Mm.
this year, which is transformative. It being a watershed moment and a time for
Mm.
transformative solutions
Yeah.
to problems that the world is facing. And
Yeah.
so it's also another way of looking at why the president said those two things.
Yeah. Siguro isa rin na hindi niya binanggit explicitly yung Ukraine and Russia actually, no? Parang
Mhm.
sinascan ko ulit yung speech niya. In contrast to a lot of other world leaders, specifically French President Macron, who was the last to speak in the morning session. So yung morning session, 9 to 3 p.m. yung allocated time. Tapos yung afternoon session, 3 until 9, pero 3 until sawa. Kung kailan matapos yung world leader. So sa morning session, medyo mahaba yung speech ni President Macron. He really drilled down on, 'di ba, the war Russia is waging against Ukraine. So yun din siguro parang what was not said, but you can also argue that the President Marcos has other things in mind, maybe things that are more specific to the Philippines. So Sophia, overall impression, siguro ito yung ibabato kong question sa iyo. Um, his harshest critics have said na parang, kumbaga, I mean, hindi lang pala harshest critics yung nagsabi nito, pero parang the Marcos team has a complicated relationship with the international community, diba? Obviously, the president's father was ousted from power in 1986. His mother and even he as the parang siya yung representative ng family assets sa mga kaso, ganun. Di ba they've faced cases in the US even, di ba? Kaya nga meron siyang yung contempt na explain na Sofia dati kasi nga head of state siya, he represents the Philippines interests. Hindi siya basta-bastang dadamputin or masasampina or ganun. So again, his harshest critics would say, na parang the international community won't fully accept him. Do you think that's the case now that, he won by a huge margin in the Philippines, first majority president in the post-EDSA era?
Mhm. I think I mean the very fact na nandun siya.
Yeah.
Um
Yeah.
Again, this is the context of, I mean, this is him. This is his first debut, kumbaga,
Yeah.
sa international community on a very important world stage. And the mere fact that he's there, I think
Yeah.
you can some people will say that um he's been accepted.
Yeah.
Um Also, when you have a mandate that is that big
Yeah.
um, in a legitimate election, other countries, other governments will respect that, because
Yeah.
that's the basic. It's the basic what they're meant
Parang
of
tenant siya
yeah,
ng UN. Yeah.
yeah, and no, and just of a democratic
Yeah.
um world.
Mm-mm.
If you
Mm-mm.
were elected legitimately, and if you the way we this in the same way that we recognize your win, you
Mm-mm.
also the Philippines would also do the same for any country, for any new world leader.
Yeah.
um that being said as well, the speech itself was it wasn't very controversial,
Yeah.
sounded stately, which
Yeah.
I think is the
Point.
least you could expect
Yeah.
from a second Marcos
Yeah.
president, him carrying all the baggage of his family
Mm-mm.
name, when he presented himself again on the world stage. And so
Yeah.
at the bare minimum, uh, there was no controversial statement, so there's little for any country or any foreign government to react violently to.
Yeah.
And in the same way that, if people were expecting President Marcos to bring up or address the complicated history he has, I
Yeah.
think, I don't know, Bea, well, for you, what would you think? But it would have been a tall order, because he hasn't even done that
Yeah.
here at
Yeah.
home.
No, even in the campaign, even as his allies would bring up or make references to his father in a positive light. Kasi syempre, mga ano to allies niya to, di ba? Si then candidate Bongbong Marcos didn't really touch on the legacy of his father. In fact, the first time that we actually heard him speak of his father with reference was during his inauguration na nanalo na siya. Pero nung
Yeah.
tumatakbo pa siya, hindi natin alam kung deliberate ba yun or parang he just didn't feel the need siguro to explicitly make a reference to the late dictator kasi um, sometimes you don't even need to because, pangalan niya pa lang, mukha niya pa lang. Alam mo na kung sino siya. Alam mo na kung sino naging tatay niya, kung ano ang bit-bit niyang history, whether you view that um, negatively or for some people positively. So, of course, you won't expect
Yeah.
President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. to bring up, di ba, the
And the
dark days of
usual
martial
of all
law.
places. Yes.
Right. Parang, kumbaga, ano naman yun? Parang bakit niya gagawin sa sarili niya yun? But jumping on what Sophia said, yeah, parang if you're talking about, like, does the international community actually accept him? Tignan niyo na lang din yung bukod sa UNGA, the fact he was invited, he faced or he addressed the UNGA during the general debates. Look at the side meetings that he had and will be having in New York. So, yung first 2 day, the second day, kasi first day Filipino community yung activity niya. Second day, he appeared before the New York Stock Exchange. Um, medyo puno din yung room. Aside from the Philippine delegation and the private sector uh, business leaders from the Philippines who attended, we also saw syempre hindi natin alam lahat ng identities nila, no? Pero we overheard a lot of mga US-based tech, fintech investors or representatives of these companies who wanted to listen to President Marcos during his fireside chat also with John Tuttle, who is the vice chairman of the New York Stock Exchange. And then on the 23rd, his last day here, he'll be having he's being hosted by the Asia Society naman. So I mean, diba, parang all these signs na not to say that he's being welcomed with open arms, or maybe you can also say that sa totoo lang, no?
But I
Pero
think
yeah,
just a
go
quick
ahead.
note, aside from all the side meetings that he's going to have with Philippine the business community,
Yeah.
also just look at yung mga bilateral meetings na President Marcos will have with other world leaders,
Yeah. Yeah.
which we like Bea and I mentioned uh, a few days ago that
Hindi natin alam yung mga araw.
time difference kasi yeah.
Yeah.
Bea and I mentioned a few days ago we do expect President Marcos to have several sideline meetings with
Mm.
other world leaders in the coming days. And so it's also something you can look at. It's also another way of looking at that.
Yeah. Yung details of who he's meeting and when he'll meet them will be released in the coming days. Normally after the fact na yun, for security reasons. And also because minsan may mga bilateral meetings na naka-iron out na, finalized na, biglang mauudlot. And sometimes it's not even the fault of the two leaders, right? Like some things, some external factors sometimes happen. And so, yeah, adjust ng mga meetings. So we'll see that in the coming days. I'll still be here covering the side meetings naman primarily. Meron din pala on the 22 dito. So mga 23, either late on the 22nd or early on the 23rd in the Philippines. Magkakaroon ng Philippine economic briefing. Kaya din andito yung bulk na economic managers ni President Marcos. Well, hindi lang naman yun yung dahilan kasi nga may mga side meetings with US-based
Yeah.
businesses and business leaders. Pero yung highlight ng economic team, they'll be hosting a briefing and a press conference. After that, the president will have an address. Pero yung bulk talaga ng speaking engagement nun will be the economic managers. Also to add din pala, no, we talked about Marcos and his family legacy. Kanina, the whole family joined him at the UN headquarters, not just the First Lady. Kasi syempre naman you expect it's not unusual for a First Lady to accompany a president in his official functions. No? Kasama din niya yung eldest child nila, si Representative Sandro Marcos, who represents Ilocos Norte, the 1st District. Kasama din nila yung two sons who are not in politics, two adult sons. You have Simon and Vincent, were also apparently at the UN headquarters with their father. Pero yung mismong pumunta sa hall ay si Sandro Marcos, si Representative Marcos, tsaka si Speaker Romualdez, who is the cousin of the president, also be seated behind them. Well, at one point, katabi ni Speaker Romualdez si Secretary Manalo of the DFA. Pero sa likod nila, nakaupo naman Sap Lagdameo, and also the two ambassadors who happen to be the father and uncle of the speaker and Secretary Lagdameo. So yung father ni Secretary Lagdameo is our ambassador naman to the UN, while the uncle of Speaker Romualdez and President Marcos, Babe Romualdez, is our ambassador to the US. So isa din yung recurring theme. I mean, it's hard to ignore the fact na magkakamag-anak sila are representing the Philippines uh, officially, di ba? On the international stage in possibly the bilateral meetings that will happen and also in business meetings like I mentioned earlier in di ko na alam kung kailan umere yun. I think a few hours ago, for example, during a meeting with Boeing and I think the other two meetings during his second day in the US, Representative Marcos and Speaker Romualdez joined the president in talking to these executives from US-based companies.
Yeah.
So, I think yun lang muna. I don't know, what did you think about the president's speech? Although parang nag-aaway lang sila sa comment sections. Wag na lang. Di na namin tatanong what your impressions were of the speech. But if you have serious and, criticisms or praises or yung impression nyo about his first address to the UNGA, leave a comment there. Sophia and I will be returning in 2, 3, di ko na alam. In in a few days to recap naman the whole trip of the president, and by that time we'll have known na who he has met for the bilateral meetings. There are big ones planned for tomorrow, so bale September 21 in New York, 22 creeping into the 22nd na yan sa Philippines. And then on the 22nd here, / the 23rd in the Philippines, meron din siyang isang malaking bilateral meeting that we expect to happen. Yeah, I think to add, so
yeah. So we're
good na tayo.
We'll see you again later this week.
We'll see you again later this week. Bye, guys. Thank you for watching Rappler.